Ancestors of mine, Michael Cadeau and an Ojibwe woman, Charlotte Epigiokwe, are a constant reminder to me that a culture existed where I live now, long before I got here. So the cultural heritage of Native Americans instantly came to mind as I was thinking about my project, Cultural Heritage of Native Americans of the Great Lakes region. I knew I was in for an enlightening exploration when the first personal image I thought of was a snapshot of me and my brother standing on either side of an Indian chief at Disneyland. It doesn't get much more stereotypical than that. Native culture has been significantly erased from the Great Lakes landscape and consciousness. While there are many tribal governments in Michigan, it is difficult to feel their presence. At the same time, there is a long continuing history of indigenous design which many of us are oblivious to. Mounds in southwest Michigan are a few of the remaining remnants of indigenous culture in the landscape, so I kept this filed away for inspiration. Then I began cobbling together different ideas about culture and technology. Gunter Demnig's stumbling stones are a beautifully simple way to integrate memory of Holocaust victims into the gut environment. I have also been intrigued with emerging augmented reality technology, especially that researched by Corning Glass and Google. Being able to engage people in rich technology as they move through the real landscape seemed like a natural fit for my topic, as I hope to make the previous culture new and relevant again. I also remembered an installation for Swatch designed by Kenya Hara, where focused laser-like beams projected working watch faces down from the ceiling onto the hands, arms, and faces of people below. Nintendo supports augmented reality with its new game systems too. I initially proposed a merging of these two technologies, the digital and the environmental, to provide windows through which people can be inspired by native indigenous Indian culture. Stones or some other informational materials placed in the environment could be recognized by smart glass of some kind, presenting relevant portrayals of indigenous Michigan design and culture, bringing it back to life. I searched the internet for any books or articles about indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes. There are many references, but many more books were available to order or borrow through libraries, so I visited my local library. I came home with a dozen or so books, and I ended up ordering a few more that weren't available otherwise. There is an expansive Great Lakes watershed, which indigenous peoples inhabited for thousands of years. What is visible of their cultures today is scattered tribal reservations, casinos, powwows and homecomings, a fine art subculture, dying language, and museum exhibits. Hundreds of years of genocide, warfare, land cessations, forced relocations, systematic destruction of the environment, and cultural assimilation have forced indigenous cultures largely to the background. All this and very little national acknowledgement outside of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. This place houses an extensive collection of cultural items, but it is still a museum, and I had hoped to create something more alive. I figured a gathering place may serve to bring all aspects of the culture together under one roof. I like the idea of people living with the natural environment. This, of course, was not by choice in the case of early inhabitants of North America, but an architectural structure could be designed to remind us of the benefits of such interconnectedness while bringing to life the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples. My next visit was to the Detroit Institute of Arts and its American Indian exhibit. It is very well designed, and there are many beautiful cultural examples, but again, it is still a museum. I did, however, find inspiration in the displays that talked about the importance of clothing to Native American identity. The exhibit asks us to consider clothing as art and identity. The idea that what you wear says a lot about who you are is particularly true among the Native Americans of the Great Lakes region. Clothing displays the skills of those who make it and the social identity of those who wear it. The elaborate and colorful clothing designs in the DIA gallery serve as expressions of cultural strength, community pride, and the persistence of traditional cultural values. From the pottery, I noticed a fascination with animals, in particular the turtle, which shows up frequently in creation myths, so I sketched a turtle to symbolize indigenous Great Lakes cultures. A couple of days later, I went to Cranbrook Natural History Museum in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. And although the Native American exhibit there was typical in its artifacts behind glass presentation, there was also short video documentaries, touchscreen guides and stories, and a holographic conversation with a young boy. Still, I kept wondering why the rich cultural heritage of indigenous people is not more widely recognized, revered, and perpetuated, as opposed to preserved, which I understand as a museum euphemism for death. I realize that designing a cultural heritage encampment is more of an architectural project, although the presentation could be a graphic design collaboration, so I realized I must narrow the scope. And just like perpetuating spoken language, we need to worry about perpetuating written language. My final trip was to Zebewing Center in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. It is a kind of museum too, but much more sensory in the presentation. The walk-through exhibit takes the form of a winding story of the Ojibwe people, integrating spoken word, natural environmental and wildlife sounds, and a lot of touching and holding. It was here that my project diverted from an architectural focus to one of language. The overarching emphasis at Zebewing was perpetuating the Ojibwe, or Chippewa, language. They consider themselves the keepers of our language, which is seen as evidence of the Chippewa philosophy and way of life. The Chippewa language is very rich and descriptive, comprised primarily of verbs and using double vowels. Chippewa is a language that is rich in detail and beautifully expressive. Today, mainly elders are fluent, and many of the younger generations are trying to learn. The effects of colonialization are still evident in that many of today's Chippewa cannot speak their language. Tribal programs on many reservations, like language camps, are now promoting language learning. The museum trips made me think closer about cultural heritage, language, spoken and written, and clothing. What is lost, for instance, when last speakers are all that remain of a language? Fabric integrates senses in addition to touch, in addition to vision. Touch, of course, but also sound, smell, taste perhaps, and all the other senses, and memory too. The idea of fabric and memory reminds me of Louise Bourgeois' fabric book, Ode to Forgetting, Perpetuate versus Preserve. My project now focused on the integration of language and clothing. I tried to pronounce and thought a lot about the meanings of various Chippewa words and phrases, and found one that I thought would be an effective and expressive brand. The word I chose means life and all its meaning. I think this is a fun way to think about the language and culture it expresses. I also continued playing with graphical elements which could become a kind of logo. I liked the idea of the turtle because it related directly to the culture, but when I came across a couple of websites dedicated to modern Indian culture, I decided to create something entirely new. Culture Fighting Spirit was particularly inspirational. In contrast to the highly staged and romanticized early 20th century photos of Native American Indians, these latest portraits reveal the struggle of an increasingly marginalized people intent on retaining their culture and heritage. The mark I chose is a kind of sun or eye, radiating with strong beams of light. Combined with the word, I think I found at least the inkling of an effective brand. So I headed to Joann's to pick out some suitable fabric. I realized my time was limited, so I had to make this doable. 2 articles of clothing would have to be where I drew the line. I connected with the concept of being wrapped in the language, so a woman's shawl was my first piece. I couldn't screen print the long word across it because my screens are not wide enough, and I did not have the skill or time to print the word in sections, so I decided to use spray paint. I was thinking about Bill's graffiti project as I looked at colors. I traced the word onto contact paper and carefully cut out the characters, and then applied the stencil to the fabric. Rust-Oleum did the trick. My two models are my wife Therese and my youngest boy Eric, thank you. The brand is a very small line of wearable clothing which can be customized with various words and phrases in Chippewa. Supporting the clothing is a website where the articles can be purchased. I modified a bootleg responsive file set so the design is not exactly as I would prefer, but it works. Finally, this is a work in progress, and one that I would like to continue exploring. Thank you.